Okay, great. So welcome. Tonight we're going to be looking at Hassidic texts on Shmita, which is a really different orientation around the difference between biblical texts, rabbinic texts, and then Hassidic texts. Partially that's just it's because the rabbis were trying to unfold kind of the implications of Shmita in a lot of ways. And I think when you learned with Becca, my suspicion is some of the texts that you looked at were really trying to discern its application. How do you create a society that functions with a Shmita, but then you don't want to create a scenario where people don't want to lend because they won't get paid back or things like that. Some of the practical concerns, halachic concerns around creating a system where Shmita is alive and real. And then how does it actually work? Because the Bible, the Torah, has a limited point of view on what it outlines in terms of Shmita. Now, the Hasidic rabbis, all the rabbis that we'll be looking at today are from the 18th century and from the areas of Belarus and Ukraine, all the areas that are so in turmoil and devastation today. And they didn't have the same practical issues around Shmita because they weren't living in the land of Israel, and far from their notion was actually translating the practicals of Shmita into a living reality in the kind of application sense of fulfilling Shmita in its formal sense. They were looking at it from a different point of view. So we're going to look at, we'll see how it goes, 3 texts based on the verses. We're looking at 2 parshiot. Shmita appears in Parashat Bahar, which is towards the end of Leviticus. And we'll be looking at 2 texts on the verses from Parashat Bahar. And we'll be looking, hopefully if we get there, to 1 text on Parashat Re'eh, which also discusses the Shmita. And probably when you studied with Roli, you looked at the idea that there was a difference in Leviticus in the book of Vayikra. The orientation around Shmita was really around land and the land lying fallow and having rest. And in the book of Deuteronomy, in Devarim, the focus of Shmita is on debt release, debt release. So it has, even within the Torah itself, there are different layers of how Shmita and its applications worked. And then obviously the rabbis unfold that. So we're gonna look today at Hassidic texts, which I think will bring a completely different voice. And what I'd like to kind of hold here as whenever I feel like I learn a text is asking the question, what is the agenda of the text? What does it want us to know? And how does it want us to think? Because for the Hasidic rabbis, the application was less salient. They have different questions in many ways. And so today we'll get to kind of be in conversation with them, at least 3 of them, about how they think about the question of Shmita. So I chose these texts just because, one, I think they offer different lenses into the questions that these rabbis are holding, but also because they're based specifically on the verses from these different parshiot, a select view of verses. So, okay, let's in my class, I usually have a reader. So I don't want to be talking the whole time because that gets really boring. So if I could ask someone to read in the English, for those who don't study with me regularly, I will interrupt you. So just be prepared for that. So if I could have someone just read in the English, no pressure to read in Hebrew. We're going to focus mostly on the English. At some points we may refer to the Hebrew, but don't worry if you're not comfortable in the Hebrew. Would anyone read in English, please? You can raise And feel free to write it. Oh, Liz, thank you. Perfect. So this is a text from the Torah Zahav, he died in 1791. No one knows really when he was born. He's the Maggid of Zolochitz, and he was a contemporary of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the kind of, people say founder of Chassidut, although he didn't know he was the founder. He was just living out his Torah. Afterwards, he became what's known as the founder of Chassidut. So, Liz, go for it.
You want me to start with this, with the
verse?
Yeah. Okay. Speak to the children of Israel, saying to them, when you come into the land I'm giving you, the land shall observe its Sabbath for Yud He Vav He. 6 years shall you plant your field. In the 7th, the land shall have a complete Sabbath.
Okay, so this is the typical orientation of the Shemitah year, right? Like, we know that after 6 years, just like we have 6 days of observance of Shabbat, of the weekdays, same to the 6 years of work and letting the land produce. And then in the 7th year, it should have a complete rest. Now we're going to see what is the Torah Zahav, Rab Benjamin, he's called, interested in. What is he going to focus on about this verse? So let's keep going, Liz.
The famous 16th century preacher, Reb Moshe Alshech, objects to the phrase, I am giving you. Isn't that completely obvious? But follow my reading of...
Wait one second, Liz, wait 1 second. Okay, so what he's pointing out, he's citing this other rabbi who's a predecessor of his, right? And saying, why does the Torah tell us that God says, I'm giving it to you in some way, like, duh, right? Like, this is understood. This is already anticipated. We know who's the speaker. So part of what the Torah Zahav, through citing Rabbi Moshe Alshech, is that it's extraneous language. In the Torah, when commentators look at the Torah, they come with the perspective, the principle of Eini Torah Lashon BaTorah. There's no extra language in the Torah. And so if there's extra language, something seems to be obvious or extraneous, most of the time rabbis of old and Hassidic rabbis take that as an opportunity to explain it, because they're uncomfortable with either the repetition or the lack of clarity or whatever, and so they have to give it meaning. And so in this case, what the Torah Zahav is doing is he's focusing on the notion, I am giving you, because it seems to be what's called baror, understood. Like, we don't need the Torah to tell us that God is giving us. That's the whole point. We knew that already in a sense, God told that to Abraham, all those parshiot to go in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, with Lech Lecha. Okay, so that's what the technical aspect he's focusing on. Now the question is, how does he give it meaning? Okay, let's keep going.
But follow my reading of, to you and to your seed after you I shall give the land. There, I asked about the phrase, to your seed. If God gives it to Jacob, isn't it clear that his offspring will possess it as well? But Alshech says elsewhere on the verse, when you come into the land that I, Yud He Vav He, bequeath to you and inherit it, that there is a difference between a gift and a bequest.
Okay, so he's looking at two words here. He's noticing a comparison that in our verse, it says give, right? It says give in the translation, natan or noten in the Hebrew. And in the verse in and then in Exodus, he speaks to the notion of bequeathing, of an inheritance. So what he's doing is he's saying, well, why in one place does it say it one way, and in another place does it say it in another way? And in doing so, he's trying to say, well, we have a problem here. Why does the Torah use different language in one verse when it's talking about you and your seed, and you and your ancestors in another verse, and it uses different language? So he's curious about why the Torah has two versions of saying the same thing in a certain sense. And most of the time, there's this notion of, like, when Rashi comments, the question is, what's bothering Rashi, right? And in this case, what's bothering the Torah Zahav, amongst others, Rab Moshe Al-Sheikh also, is that there must be a distinction between what it means to give and what it means to bequeath, or else the Torah wouldn't have used different languages, different words. And so therefore, he's trying to uncover what that difference is. Is everyone with me? Okay, perfect. Lots of nodding heads. I like that. Okay, keep going.
A gift may be conditional, giving them the land if they fulfill the Torah, and stopping that gift if they do not. If the land is a bequest, there is no taking it back from them.
Okay, so what's his answer to the question of the difference? What is a gift versus what is a bequest? Anyone?
Well,
Yeah, Judy.
one can be taken back if they don't do what they're part of the bargain. The other one is it's permanent. It's a bequeathal. It becomes theirs no matter what.
Correct. So in a giving, you can take it back. If there's a conditionality to giving, that isn't true of bequeathing. In a version of conditionality, at least how Rab Moshe Al-Sheikh does this, that the notion of the giving of the land is conditional upon the Israelites fulfilling the Torah. But a bequeathing the land is not conditional. It's theirs forever. So in one version, the notion of you and your ancestors, it's not an in perpetuity guarantee that one receives the giving of the land, because if one doesn't fulfill the Torah, then the land, the occupation, I don't mean that in the Lameh, the notion of living in the land is not a guarantee. I mean, and by the way, right, this is a really powerful understanding of the nature of the relationship with the land of Israel. This is not any land we're talking about. This is the land of Israel. So in this text, we're learning that there is one notion of the conditionality of the land for future generations, and another notion of bequesting the land to the coming generations. So now that we know what the two versions means, the question is, how do you hold both? Because the Torah is not saying, well, one overrides the other. In some sense, in the different books of the Torah, we have them living side by side. So in that's a conflict. These are two very different ideas, by the way, which repel the Jewish people until today, right? That some people feel that the land of Israel has been promised by God to the Jewish people without any sense of conditionality. And others, I'm just going to post the text again for those, sorry. And others believe that our relationship with the land is dependent upon it living out the ideals and values of the Torah. Those are very big, different ideological positions that make people function in very different ways around their relationship to the lands of Israel. That's a topic for another time, but it is a driver. By the way, I'll just say this too around this question, which is these texts are written in exile. And so, obviously the exile from the land was well before the 18th century. So this is not new information, but there's a lot of wrestling around the questions with why exile, and the tradition often doesn't make exile from the land something that is externally given, externally happens to us. There are lots of ways that we're conquered and exiled from the land, and from a historical perspective, but often the tradition reads that exile in light of our own sins, in light of our own sin. So, I mean, that's Tisha B'Av in a nutshell, which is not in a sense of to blame the victim, but in many ways, the Torah's interest is into soul searching about why we're in a position of distance and exile, which in Hassidic terms means not only exile from the land, but exile from God, which is manifest in the distance from the land. Okay, let's keep going.
Do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah, keep going, Liz. You're doing great.
That is the meaning of our verse, when you come into the land I'm giving you as a gift. See that your deeds are worthy, so that it might also become an inheritance, remaining yours without interruption. Had God said, I shall give you the land as an inheritance, once Abraham observed the entire Torah, it would have stayed in the inherited possession of his offspring, even if they hadn't fulfilled the Torah. God would have been unable to take it from them. Therefore, he said, to you and to your seed after you I shall give, meaning that as I give it to you as a conditional gift, so do I give it to your offspring, depending on their fulfilling the Torah. The Talmud tells us that one who says, my property goes to you, but afterwards to someone else, must be listened to.
Okay, so this is playing out the perspective about God telling Abraham that it wasn't an inheritance, that it really depended on how future generations would behave, and that it was a conditional gift, right? That God didn't say, I shall give you the land as an inheritance. If God had said that, it would have been a guarantee. But even from Abraham, the notion of the giving of the land was giving, not bequeathing, which makes generations that followed Abraham accountable to the question of the fulfillment of the Torah. Now, also just to keep in mind, we've been studying this in my class as well, is that at the time of Abraham, there was no Torah to fulfill, right? There was even no notion of what the Torah was, but the anticipation was that the Israelites would get the land, they would come into the land with the Torah. By the time they're at the edge of the land, obviously, they have the Torah. Okay, let's keep going.
In this way, we understand the Talmudic juxtaposition of the two verses, the earth and all within it belong to Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, and the earth has he given to the children of Adam. Both verses are correct. The latter verse applies when people do God's will, fulfilling the commandments that apply to the land. Then it passes to them as inheritance. But when they do not, earth belongs to Yud-Heh Vav-Heh.
Okay. So where does he land? How does he hold both stories at the same time? In some way, this is a fulfillment of the notion, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. And of course, the Torah has to be that way. There is nothing in the Torah that the rabbis of old or Hasidic rabbis would say will not be true. So how does he make sense or hold both of these verses at the same time in both notions, which is it's both something I give to you as well as it being fully mine? That's a verse that says Kili kol haaretz, the land is completely mine, which is one of the drivers, of course, of the Shemitah year, is that we're not the owners of the land, it's ultimately God's. Yes, Judy?
I guess he's saying that it is true that it's a bequeathal so long as we do what we have to do. So that's the truth of that statement. But it always, we are the ones that make that a bequeathal by doing what we have to do. Without that, then it becomes God's again. And it was funny, as I was like listening to it, I just felt so much about climate change. Like, it just feels like the truth of this is we're living out in such a intense way in our generation.
Beautiful, beautiful. So in a sense, what he's doing is in these, and this is very true of the way rabbis function around the text, is like, when it's this way, it's this verse. And when it's this way, it's this verse. And so the hope, in a sense, is that it will, yes, I think you're right, Joyce. It's more like a contract. Like if we fulfill our ends, then we get the full story. But if we break the contract, of course, is the Torah. That's our covenant. That's our covenantal material. You know, in a sense, that's what binds us to God. That's the relationship and how it's guided. The short sheet, it is in the chat, but I'll put it in again. Is regulated by the Torah. That's how our relationship with God is regulated. And therefore, when we don't fulfill, then ultimately the land reverts back to ultimately God's ownership. And in a sense, and when we do fulfill, then it's ours. So I want to go back to my original question this is on Shemitah. These are verses that are being explicated by this Rebbe on Shemitah. So the question is, what's the takeaway here? What does he want us to understand from this verse? Since it's not, he doesn't even say, by the way, so the Shemitah year is blah, blah, blah. He doesn't reference the Shemitah year at all. He is just using the language of Shemitah and its context to explicate this idea about the relationship with the land. So why is he doing that? And therefore, what might we discern or potentially apply to the Shemitah? Nilda or Stephen? I don't know who's Nilda.
Yeah, I think it's what God is saying, or these verses are telling us, is this is on loan. God is loaning you this land in relation to Shemitah. God is loaning you this land. Do what's right by it, and then let it rest. And come the year after Shemitah, you get to have the land back, but only if you let it rest.
Okay, so it's interesting, like you're reading his perspective into the cycle of Shemitah. Now, the question is, I think in some ways, I would venture to say he's not so interested actually in the cycle writ large. Like his interest in explicating, it may be that the Shemitah is a spiritual practice for being in this relationship with the land, which is what Shemitah does is it recognizes that we're not in charge all the time, and that ultimately it is God, that it's kili kol haaretz, because the land is ultimately mine. And so the practice of Shemitah is to get us to this spiritual orientation, right? Which is that the land is on loan, particularly if we're not going to behave according to the rules of the Torah. But if we fulfill our end of the contract or the covenant, then it is a bequethal. Then it is promised because we're fulfilling our part of the bargain, our part of the commitment. But I think what I would say is he's and I think this is true about a lot of Hassidic teaching, is it's less concerned in the specificity of the Shemitah itself and more concerned in the big kind of theological relationship with the land, and how do we think about our relationship with God and with the land, and less specifically about the Shemitah itself. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? And in a sense, the Shemitah is the jumping off point, but it's not necessarily the end game. Because you could say, according to his theological, ideological construction, we wouldn't need the Shemitah if we were fulfilling the Torah at all times. The Shemitah is actually the practice that sets us up to restart again. But if we're fulfilling the Torah, then we wouldn't need it. but the assumption actually in the Shemitah is probably, and we'll see a little bit this in another text, that it's a built-in correction tool to probably our orientation about living on the land.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please. Who's that?
That just popped into my mind.
Oh, Stephen.
Yeah, the other one here.
Yeah.
From I guess a real New York perspective, I'm thinking it reminds me of a situation where someone who owns land grants someone else the right to build on that land, but the original owner still owns the land itself, but the other person can use the land for his building, maintain it, and so long as that building is there, that person can use it. But if something, if that building is destroyed, the original owner regains the rights to the actual land itself. And that the climate change reference before that sort of triggered that thought also, that God's saying, do well with the land, but if it can't sustain you because of your actions, it's all coming back to me.
Yes, and I think there's the negative aspect with it is like it's no guarantee if you can fulfill, and the positive aspect, which Shelley just put in the chat, is that is true, but also the truth is you can always come back because you have the possibility to fulfill, right? That it's never a definitional end to the covenant, that's why both verses live side by side in a sense. Both notions live simultaneously, which is there is the hope in a sense of inheritance, but we live within the tension between the gift and the inheritance. And so for when we're exiled from God, the hope is that the bequeath notion is still alive and well, and we just have to live up to that. Once again, we have to do our tshuva, we could say, but the other orientation is lest you get too haughty and consider the land your own or stray from the centrality of the Torah, then the risk is you're going to lose your relationship. And of course, in this sense, these texts are written by people who are not living on the land, who are not in the practices of Shemitah. Mostly this stuff, I think, is about their relationship with God and what it means to have the potential to reconnect and to fulfill the notion of being in relationship, even when one is not yet back in the land with that. Our tradition is was incredibly for 2,000 years amazing at creating this very strong longing towards back to the land. And in Hassidic space, that's often just about bridging the distance between us and God, and which the land is kind of the testament to whether it's working or not. And I just want to also say with the climate change orientation, I think there is no dispute that the ways that Shemitah is thought about, both in, you could say in biblical, rabbinic, and in many ways these texts, it all relates because the notion is the abuse of the planet, of which a central aspect of our orientation is as a people is to understand that the land is God's and to treat it in that way, that we are, we're not the owners of it, and therefore how we treat it, and we, in a sense, we bear the burden of when we don't treat it as such. So I think that the analogy functions in this regard. All right, let's move. Yes, Judy.
This might be going way too far, and it may come up in the next readings and stuff, but the thing about sort of what is always offered to us, the return is always offered to us. And what came to my mind was, Heschel, about the fact that what made sacred first was not a thing or land, but time. And sort of in the Hasidic tradition, that it is about the relationship to holiness, and that in a sense, the Shemitah is our opportunity, that exile is a holy place, that a lot of times that's where we do find our holiness. And so in a sense, Shemitah gives us that opportunity to get to the basics, however you want it, and because we need that, because otherwise we kind of get, lost in the materialism.
Yeah, I think, for the way exile in general is understood in Hassidic terms is to be exiled from God. It's not, it's always understood in that notion of metaphor, which is exile is just to be distant from God, less about the centrality of the land, because they were not in the land. And, even if Herzl was coming down the pike a little later than some of these, at least the ones that we're studying today, that wasn't the reality they were living in, is some recognition that would come true. So I think in many ways, against the Shemitah is an invitation for return, for sure, and to get back to essence and essential, which is certainly a very deep part of the ideas of Hasidut in general. All right, I'm posting the text again for those who join a little late. Okay, so the next text is on the same section. It's not on the same verses, but on the same parasha in Bahar, and it's a text from Noam Elimelech of Lezhensk, who Lezhensk is in Poland at the time. He was in the inner circle of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. So he's considered third generation Hasidic master, of which a lot of the guys we study are in that third generation. The Mea Shiloach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, the Levi Yitzhak of Berecheb. A lot of the famous Hasidic masters are in the third generation, coming from the Maggid of Mezrich. He lived for 1717 to 1786, and he's most famously known actually for, this doesn't really apply to the text that we're studying. A lot of his texts speak to the role of the tzaddik, which is the Rebbe in Hasidic terms. And in many ways, the tzaddik was understood prior to him as being kind of a lone tzaddik, that the righteous person, the Rebbe, was in a sense very distant and more interested in a sense of the relationship with God, and less invested in the notion of the tzaddik as the guider of community and the person who was channeling God through community. And Noam Elimelech really unfolded the tzaddik role that was neither one nor the other. And so that's part of what many of his texts focus on, although the particular text that we're studying today is not related, although many of his texts are focused on the role of the tzaddik. All right, someone else wants to read in the English. Oh, come on, people. I know people read English. It's not, Oh, Judy, will you do it? You're on, I just see you're unmuted. There we go.
You got it.
Okay.
Okay, so, and should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year? If we may neither sow nor gather in our crops, I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years.
Okay, so these are the verses from Leviticus itself, from the parasha. And so this is where his attention is going to be focused, and you'll see what's bolded is where he's interested, and we'll see that unfold in how he teaches this verse. Okay, go ahead.
I offer the following teaching in the name of my pious and famous brother.
Oh,
No,
he was another famous one. It's true. He's not lying.
Note, the Torah here deviates from its normal style. Generally, scripture will include some seemingly extraneous language in a verse, even if only one letter, for the sake of then explaining and resolving questions that can be raised. But the question itself is never actually written in the Torah. Yet here, the question is explicit. It would
Okay,
have been better.
Stop right there. Stop right there. Okay, so what is he saying? So he's using the principle that I just spoke about earlier, which is Ein Tor Lashon B'Torah. There's no extra language in the Torah. Even one letter is put in a verse to make us ask certain questions in order to be able to interpret and unfold. That is kind of the linchpin of our tradition, is this interpretive process by which the Torah gifts us, or bequeaths us, one could say, an ever-searching way to ask questions of the Torah in order to unfold God's revelation in each, in each time, in each place. So what is he focusing on here? What's strange about this particular passage, according to Noam Elimelech, or his brother for that matter? Yeah, Jane. Up, you're muted, Jane.
Usually we have to guess the question.
Yes. Yes, normally the Torah doesn't put forth the question. It's not like the Torah sets it up. It's normally we get through what's bothering Rashi, right? The commentators ask the question and then answer the question. But in this case, the Torah itself is asking the question, and that's unusual. And it's true. We don't normally hear the narrative that's going on in, quote, the people's heads. Is like, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to eat in the year when we're not able to sow the land, etc. Okay, so that's what he sees as in this case. Now, this is, that's his perspective, which is the Torah is doing something that it doesn't normally do, and therefore it's crying out, interpret me, interpret me. Okay, keep going.
It would have been better only to have written, I will ordain my blessing, in which case no one would dare challenge, saying, what are we to eat?
Right, if God says, I'm gonna give you what you need, I'm gonna bless you, who would ask, why, what are we gonna do? God could have just said that and it would have been, Dayenu, it would have been enough. But in this case, the Torah says it, so it must mean something in particular, because it's not like God would say the second thing as a response. I mean, he has to understand what's the relationship between asking the question and I will ordain a blessing. What is the nature of what the question indicates? Okay, so that's what his interest is, and that's what this text is going to unfold. Keep going.
But see, when God created the world, God of God's goodness provided conduits that directed the flow, fulfilling people's needs. The condition of the flow was not ever to stop. But when people fall from their degree and have no trust that the blessed Creator is a faithful overseer, feeding and sustaining expansively and without any interruption, with their impure thoughts, these people damage the upper worlds and weaken the power of the divine retinue. This means that the flow is interrupted, and God then must ordain that shefa anew so that it will flow as it did from the start of creation.
Okay, all right, so he's setting up a scenario, which is, the baseline is that, and this is very Hassidic, the language is very Hassidic, which is that in God's creation of the world, divine flow is it is ongoing, right? The nature of God in God's goodness is to let the divine flow in Hasidic language, it's called shefa, flow, and sets up conduits for this to be an ongoing operation, basically, and to provide for all essentially that we need. And what is our role in that, according to Noam Elimelech? Yes, Pia. Can you unmute? Yeah.
To trust that, to not have anxiety about it, to allow the flow to remain continuous, essentially.
Yes, exactly. That the orientation is of our role is to remain faithful. In the language in the Hebrew here is bitachon, which in modern Hebrew means security. You'll see that on the back of policemen in Israel. But bitachon is the sense of safety and security that God will provide. And what happens if we don't have that, according to Noam Elimelech? Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
It actually disrupts what the ability of the divine to do what the divine does. So it sort of relates to that Hassidic view that in the same way that, that there is a relationship between the two worlds, and it goes in both directions.
Yeah, that in our questioning, in putting forth, we disrupt the flow. We catalyze something that actually shuts down the flow from the heavens, and which is both, you could say, speaks to both our power and our humility all at the same time, right? Which is, we have the power to impact the flow. I mean, which speaks to how strongly we're in relationship with the heavens. Obviously, the humility is the opposite end of the coin, which is in our anxiety and all those kinds of things, we are implicated in, we don't and we do control, in a sense, by those things. Yes, Jane.
Isn't Noam Elimelech doing the same thing by asking questions of the Torah? In other words, you say that it's our tradition to always ask, what if, and why is this, and why is the Torah written this way? And they are not, they don't lose their portion because of that. That's how we gain our portion. So it seems like it's a contradiction.
I think it depends how you're asking, right? There are questions that are, the intention of the question in any version of a commentator is obviously to seek out God's word. In this case, the question is a provocative one, which says, how are we going to survive? We don't trust you, which is not the orientation of commentators. The orientation of commentators is to say, God must have, they don't ask the question explicitly. Most of the time, they're answering a problem that they see in the text to say, oh, it's crying out for me to explain. So the deference is for sure given to the Torah and God's word, and to try to explicate that for the sake of bringing forth God's word, in the voice of the people. That's articulated here with this question, which is, what are we to eat in the seventh year, is one that expresses a lack of faith. So I think that's the difference. Is one is an orientation to faith in the text and a desire to unfold that. The other orientation is to question God and God's power and God's goodness also. So I don't think any of the commentators are perceived to be. It's interesting, when I was in rabbinical school, in one of my classes that was actually a Hassidic, we were studying Itarei Torah, which is I've taught this before. It's a compilation primarily of little Hassidic snippets on the parasha, and we had to write these one-pager teachings on. We had to choose one of the texts and write a one-page like Devar Torah. And one time I used a text negatively to say that I didn't buy the text, basically. And my teacher said, you should never use the text negatively. That's what his orientation was. Now, I don't know that I buy that. Like, I think there's too many, particularly as a woman. But that's what I would say, the rabbis of old and these rabbis are not interested in using the text negatively. They're using the text for the sake of more divine connection and more divine commitment. So that's how I would distinguish. All right. So what he's saying essentially is the necessariness of the ordaining of the blessing is in response to the question. Does everyone get that? The second ordaining, there are two issues. The text is a conditional text, which is if you're going to ask, what are we to eat? Then I'm going to have to ordain blessing because you're the one who stopped up the flow. And so I then have to ordain it because you've actually interrupted the flow. Okay, let's keep going.
We see this in our verse, and should you ask, etc. The Torah here instructs us how to walk in God's ways. Our trust in God must be complete and never ask, what are we to eat? For should we fall out of trust thinking, what are we to eat? We damage the flow and trouble heaven to ordain it anew. Thus, and should you ask means, when you speak thus, you trouble me, so that then I will have to ordain it. So do not behave in this manner, but trust in God with all your heart, and the Shefa will flow without interruption, and you will never lack anything.
Okay, so he makes his point. It's in many ways, this is the orientation of Hassidic masters, and is a fullness of faith. There's not a lot of doubt expressed in Chassidut. There's a certain, some might say, simplicity of faith, but in general, obviously, the rabbis of old and the Hasidic rabbis are cultivating, their inclination is to focus on that, whereas we as postmoderns or moderns are much more drawn, I think, to the notion of doubt and questioning in a very particular way, in a provocative way. But according to the Noam Elimelech, again, and this is focused on Shemitah, but it's ultimately not about Shemitah. Like neither of these things are a particular application of Shemitah as an applied issue. It's to kind of recognize that the sense of being without, right, which is what the Shemitah year represents, which is what is perceived as being no guarantee, which might awaken the question, or going back to Pia's word, anxiety, the sense of withoutness that is oriented in the Shemitah would send some people into a spiritual state of lack and anxiety, which is then puts them in a lack of flow, which means their own concerns about lack actually make lack true. It's important that our own anxiety, our own worry about not having enough is what actually stops the flow. And I think that it shouldn't be understated, because what we think about in this sense is that one thing then causes the other, which is true. Then God has to function and restart the system. But it's like the worry is actually what becomes, which is, I think, a deeply psychological, psycho-spiritual orientation, which is sometimes when we orient towards a specific feeling of without or lack, spiritually, there are plenty of people, by the way, who are without and lack and are well deserving of asking those questions. So I'm speaking mostly in psycho-spiritual terms, but I would say also these texts are written not in the most loving of communities all the time. And there's a piece of the Hasidic community that was well endowed with money, et cetera. But of course, when you think about Eastern European Jewry and what people experienced in the 1800s, 1900s, it wasn't all pretty. So the part of what the Noam Elimelech is trying to orient is to have a sense of faith amidst lack, which was not a condition that was necessarily only a once every 7 years, but was the state of some people forever, that's the way people live. Many people live without a lot. And part of Chassidut, and often these texts are it's exactly true. That's what I mean by that, is like there are plenty of people who live this way all the time. But what he's trying to do, I think, in this orientation, in this trying to reach people, is to say, trust even amidst that. And you don't want to be a catalyzer of lack, even if you feel it. And that lack, and again, this is, I say this with a lot of caveats, that, he understands lack in many ways as a spiritual lack. Again, because the Shemitah isn't operating with them, but the notion of lack for sure is operating in their community. Bye, Shelley. Yes, Judy, you were going to say something.
What I was going to say is that coming from a community that lacked in prison, that I think that actually this notion has a lot of resonance to the faith that people, that we've come this far by faith, that it's to have a sort of surety of faith, which is not based on having materially, but believing, is part of how we sustain ourselves through periods of material lack. So I think there's something that resonates with this, particularly in moments, that in moments when we need faith, because it's so easy to because the anxiety of lack of faith doesn't sort of lead to sort of opening, questioning that gets us places. It kind of leads into alienation and going, sort of collapsing of connections, and that all we have sometimes is that faith and how it connects us spiritually to each other and to something larger.
Yes, beautiful. I think there's a deep truth about that, about how Hassidic masters do that. And I think in a sense, and for those of us who studied the Eish Kodesh, the Pia Setzner Rebbe who lived during the Shoah, who speaks to a sense, it's like, if I'm going to be without, I just don't want to be without God, right? If I'm going to be without so many things and certain versions of security, what I don't want to be is without faith. And so I think, it's again, very, it's not a natural place for many of us to live in this space. It feels often oversimplified, or, doesn't leave enough room for our own versions of doubt. At the same time, I think we, and I always return back, I feel like I've referenced this a couple of times in the last couple of days. I've always been struck, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Alav Shalom, who has this beautiful video, which I think I shared in one class many years ago, or a number of years ago, that faith is a verb, not a noun. That you don't, he says, in ways that he could have only said, he's like, you don't go to a grocery store basically and buy faith on a shelf. It's not something you acquire, it's something you do. And I think, put in those terms, I think this idea of faith is deeply powerful, which is we move through things. We don't get something or lose it. We move through it. And so for a lot of us, we think of faith often as declaration of belief, which doesn't often make sense with our intellectual willingness to declare, I believe in God, because then it means I have to know what God does and what God doesn't do. Faith is of a different quality than belief. And I think the idea of what Zalman points to, and I think what many Hasidic masters point to, it's the engine by which we survive. It's what sustains us. And I think there are many ways to discover that in the world. For some, community functions in that way, or the divine amongst us, in relationship. I mean, there are many ways to talk about how we experience God and experience faith. And I think it's also a really challenging and important concept to understand when our anxiety cuts us off from what we need the most, when our worry cuts us off from what we need the most, which is what he's trying to convey here is we're our own worst enemy in a sense, that it's not God who shuts off, it's we who shut off. And how can we maintain, even in the most challenging of circumstances, some sense of trust and faithfulness that we can make it through? And I think these texts in the times that we've been living in feel in some way the most deeply compelling and also the most challenging at the same time. Because I think, and I'll get you in a minute, Liz. Also, I don't think these texts make us passive human beings. Like, they're not saying don't do the right thing or don't become an activist, or, it's not saying surrender to the world as it is, although there is obviously a strain in our tradition of being happy with your lot, and there's a merit to that, right? But the longing is ultimately for God, not for filling what's missing. It's ultimately the deepest missing is with God. Yes, Liz.
So you can kind of take that lens back to the first quote, the first text we were reading, because then you're kind of saying that the gift, the land is a gift, is, sorry, my phone's ringing. It becomes very transactional. My phone's on the other side of the room. Sorry.
So we can handle it. If you can handle it.
Hold on 1 second. Let me just.
Okay.
Plus, it's like a telemarketer. So the gift becomes very transactional, right? Like I give it to, whereas a bequest to your point is a leap of faith, right? That there's more. You just have to hope that that's where you're going, that your day-to-day activities will make you not just worthy of that bequest, but that there's something more to it, which it's beyond the transactional. It's something that comes from, I guess, I don't want to say a style of life, but it comes from something, a greater power, something beyond than just, whatever, sowing taking care of the fields or what have you.
I would say, I think there is a relationship between the texts in terms of conditionality. What links the two texts, right, is the notion that we can be in a flow relationship with God, which is the bequeath orientation, which is God's orientation, right? That ultimately, at least the second text points to more distinctly, that God is, in God's goodness, is a God of shefba, is a God of flow, which is also a God of giving, of bequeathing. That's who God wants to be, essentially, and wants to be in relationship with us in that way. It's we who get in the way of that, according to these texts, because we don't live up to the Torah, and therefore the conditionality is we don't get to live in that constancy, or we break the flow, as is in this case, by questioning God's intention in its God's flow, that it won't always. So I think that's the relationship between the two texts. It's not God who wants it to be transactional. It's we who are in some way in control in the most humble of ways to be in relationship, because in Hassidic space, Hassidic thinking, there is no God in us. It's that we're all connected, and it's we who often are the ones who create the impediment. And so God's nature and the universe filled with God's presence are by design or by nature to be in flow. But it's we human beings with our fallibility, with our mistakes, with our sins, etc., that put ourselves in exile. And who break the flow, which forces, at least in this text, then God has to deal with it. God has to restart. So I think that's really, in many ways, what links these two texts, both around the Shemitah, which is a systematic experience. It's a spiritual practice of not being tied. That of not being bound up with the land, of not being bound up with goods, of not being bound up, in that sense. So you could say, although I don't think this is ultimately what these Hassidic masters are most interested in about Shemitah as a principle, what they're interested in is the fact that it puts us in these cycles of recognizing that we can live in two kinds of spaces. And it's a practice in the same way that Shabbat is a practice to teach us about essence and the flow that we want to be in, etc. So let's move to the last text. I'm going to read it so I don't have to ask anyone, and no one has to be embarrassed to read. This is a text based on the section in Deuteronomy in Parashat Re'eh about what happens around money giving and lending and debt relief in this period of the sabbatical year. It's a text of the Or Chaim, who also lived in the 18th. He was born in 1758 and he died in 1816. So like a 25-year difference from the others, a little bit later. And he was from Zlatow. He's the rabbi of Zlatow. So he's explicating based on these verses from Deuteronomy. Take care lest there be an unworthy word within your heart that says, the 7th year, the sabbatical is coming close. Then you look with wicked eye at your poor brother and do not give it to him. Because the notion is if you would give as you anticipate the sabbatical year, you wouldn't give because then the debt would be released. You wouldn't get your money back. And so if you studied with Becca, there's something called the Prose Bowl that actually kind of created a scenario where people who gave towards in anticipation of the sabbatical year would get paid back because they realized it would stop the flow of money, basically, if everyone thought they would never get paid back. But that's a subject for another time. So he will call out to God about you, and you shall have a sin, meaning the poor brother will call out to God about you, and you essentially are owning that sin. Surely give to him. Let your heart not feel bad as you do so, meaning resentful resentful is the best word, because for this thing, Adonai your God will bless you in every deed to which you set your hand. So just to be clear, the scenario is the sabbatical year is the Torah anticipates the ambivalence about the sabbatical year because you can't have a society where no one ever gets paid back. But as the sabbatical year is rounding its corner, people get tighter with their pockets because they understand that the debts will be released and they won't get paid back. And so what the Torah does is instructs you that God is actually on the side of the poor person. That's a big part of what this section of Deuteronomy does, is that God always is responsive to the one with less. And therefore the question is, how do we hold our ambivalence? This is like and we'll see how he plays this out, but so everyone understands the scenario that we're working with. Yes? Okay. Couldn't the text simply have said, lest your heart be unworthy? Why does it need to refer to a word here? Where is it? Yes. Take care lest there be an unworthy word within your heart. So what is he doing? He's focusing on what appears to be an extraneous language Eini Tor Lashon BaTorah. There's no extra language in the Torah. And the word here, why is it necessary? How does one have an unworthy word in their heart? You just have an unworthy heart. So that's where he's focused. Why does it say word here? The evil urge comes to you in order to turn you off the path. This is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And you might hear in our times, people say you're off the derech. This is understood in like very traditional Hassidic communities. Someone who goes off the derech, off the path, is someone who leaves the community and is sinful. Keeping you from giving alms to one who is upright and needy. So what he's saying basically is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, has gotten a hold of you. This is a rabbinic notion. It's not only a Hasidic notion. Rabbinic, I mean like Mishnah Talmud notion, is that we have evil and a good inclination, and we're consistently fighting amongst them, leading to one or the other. It's like the idea, I assume this is where the idea of the devil and the angel on the shoulders comes from. It's a manifestation of the traditional notions of the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, the evil and the good inclination. So it's pulling you off the path, which meaning of servicing God, because it's holding you back from being in flow. Right? The same ideas, which is that we're holding back, we're withheld with the upright and the needy. And in this case, right, the Orach L'Chaim adds the notion of uprightness, right? It's not only does he say the needy, but he adds the notion that one might say, well, maybe the needy isn't upright. That's maybe why they're poor. There could be assumptions of hoisting judgment on people who are needy. In this case, he pushes against that and calls them upright. So the wicked one uses words of Torah to convince you that you don't have to give, like the Torah's teaching that your life comes first. Essentially saying the Yetzer Hara is kind of saying you should put your life first, which there are scenarios in the Torah or in the rabbinic tradition that are saying your life comes first. And this is true, like within the context of tzedakah, that you have to make sure you have enough in order then to give. But lest you kind of use the words of Torah, he's saying, to convince yourself that you shouldn't give. That's what he's saying. That's the evil inclination getting you, because it's convincing you through the Torah's language, through the words of Torah, to be stingy, basically. And that's so that's the point of the word, especially in the sabbatical year, when we do no planting, the evil one who will seek to prevent us from giving by saying, prepare yourself for what you will need to eat in the 7th year, since your own life comes first. So what he's doing is he's taking the notion that your life comes first, which is a principle in Baba Metzia in the Talmud, and he's saying, you could have that orientation full time, which will coach you, because that's the evil inclination at play, to actually not give and make excuses for not being generous to the poor, particularly when the sabbatical year is coming down, when we have to be extra attentive to making sure we have enough. And I love this text because I think this is something how we rationalize things all the time. Like, oh, I just want to make sure this, or I just want to make sure that, or what, well, I can't commit to that because I might have to do this. Like, we rationalize with holy excuses. Basically, that's what he's saying. Or we use Torah principles in order to protect ourselves from being generous or giving flow, or even often, I think, I hate to say this, the Jewish people sometimes prioritize itself at the expense of others, even though we don't actually have to be worried about ourselves sometimes. Not all the time, but that those dynamics are at play. We give deference to holy principles, which actually make us sinful. Oh boy. But if you have a good heart, you will have the faith that God will provide from heaven. Scripture speaks of this in saying, should you ask, what will we eat in the 7th year? Back from the previous text, we are not planting and not gathering in our crops. It answers, I will command my blessings for you in the 6th year, and it will provide sufficient produce for 3 years. Again, so he doesn't take the Noam Elimelech's perspective. He's just reading the text as is. You know, this is the response to what if I won't have enough? It's God will provide enough. That's enough. Now, Torah is referred to as the word, as in a word commanded to the 1000th generation. They have to make an equivalence to find out why is Torah understood as the word here. That is the meaning of word in our verse. Should you have words of Torah that release you from your obligation to give, things like your life comes first within your heart, this is unworthy, meaning that your heart is being unworthy. You are listening to the counsel of the wicked one, who is showing you these words of Torah, telling you that you don't have to give. If you had a good heart, you would have the faith of which we have spoken. It is only because your heart is being unworthy that you sought out this Torah teaching, causing you to look with a wicked eye at your poor brother and to say, my life comes first. So it's a powerful teaching on the abuse of the tradition for bad means. You know, that we sometimes use proof texts in our traditions to let ourselves off the hook of treating people with generosity and with flow and a preservation. Now, there is a principle of preservation of life, but it's not only for ourselves. It's really how do we become the conduit of that for others. So none of these texts necessarily are a translation of the Shemitah year in terms of 6 years and 1 year. Most of the Hassidic masters look at these texts in much larger, more macro questions around how do we think about faith? How do we think about sustenance and enough? How do we think about what it means to be in relationships to others? And how do we allow God's flow to sustain itself in order to provide, as well as how do we extend that to others, that it's not just God's flow, but we're the conduits of that in the world at large. So I think these ideas, all of which could apply to the Shemitah year, but aren't read in very narrow terms, which is often the way Hasidic masters look at texts, because the practicals of translation, particularly when it comes to the land, are not alive for them. It's a very distant notion. And so they read all the Shemitah texts in a much more largesse way in order to us to have an orientation about what sustenance and faith and giving and flow look like, which are cornerstones of framework for thinking about the world. So I hope these texts offered some new ideas around the Shemitah year. And I hope they, I think particularly, they all, I think in their own way, are challenging in our own existence, and particularly at a time of lack, and how we metabolize that, and how do we become conduits for flow in the world rather than impediments. So I'm gonna just end with Kaddish Rabbanan. I'm sorry I didn't put that on the sheet, but if you have a Siddur, you can rise on page 20. And it's so nice to see everyone. And if you want to unmute, you're welcome to do so. Yitgadal v'yikadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'bizman kariv v'yamru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah v'rach le'olam olmei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei kudesha brichu. Min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran v'alma v'yamru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon, v'al kol Tamidehon, v'al kol man daskin ba'oraita, diva atra hadin, v'diva chol atar v'atar, yehe lehon ochon shlama rabba, china v'chista v'rachamin, v'chayin arichinu mizona revicha, orvokana min kadam v'hon v'shamaya v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Shlama Rabba min Shemaya, L'chaim tovim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen. Yaseh shalom b'romav, hu berachamav yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Have a great night, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well.